Welcome to freedomlovin.com, where we focus on building freedom in an unfree world. Through personal development, location independence, and passive income strategies. Now here's your host, Kevin Koskela.
Welcome to Freedom Lovin'. This is Kevin, and this is episode number 72. And in just a minute, I have part 2 with my interview with Kevin G about radical optimism. So I don't have anything much else to say. I'm actually moving apartments here in a couple days, so I'm launching a new sales funnel. So it's been a really busy time, but enjoy the interview. I hope you're doing well. Go out there and build some freedom, and we'll have more for you next week. Take care. Right. Yeah, it's like spelling. I think there's people that are worried about we've lost our ability to spell because we have Google. Well, why is that even important?
Right.
What? Yeah, I mean, all these spelling bee champs are. It's a nice thing to have a good memory, but the idea of having to spell or to do math, like, yeah, you have a calculator. I mean, that's something that we can use. It doesn't have to be all done on paper or in our heads.
Right.
Yeah. So
we should get worried when idiocracy rears its head. But I don't see any evidence of that. I think the burden of proof is on those people saying that we're getting dumber. I mean, show me how we're getting dumber.
Yeah, exactly. So a couple more things here. The myth is we work ourselves to death, and I feel that sometimes. But I also have questioned that myself because I'm always wondering, like, is that true? Like, do we really work ourselves to death? People talk about, especially what I do, like, you know, I kind of, I'm a location independent entrepreneur, so I'm in other countries, and people talk about how, like, America is just a country full of workaholics, and it's way better in places like France because they can only work 37 hours a week or something like that, and it's so much better for your health. But what's the truth here?
I actually don't know the answer to that. It may be good that what France is doing. I don't know. The statistics are that the annual hours worked per person from, let's say, the mid-1800s to today has been decreasing. And that's just because, you know, we're not tilling the soil all day long. Now, a lot of people may take the extra time that they have and, you know, make even more work or whatever. And I don't know if that's good or not, but I think a lot of us do have that choice, and that's really important to see. And, you know, maybe people need to experiment to see what makes them happier. But it's clear that we have enough excess wealth that we can actually choose to work less hours, or we don't have to spend all day in the farm.
Yeah, and you said the idea of child labor it's actually going down. I'm not really understanding this graph. It's like child labor versus income.
Yeah, so what this graph is showing is that as income increases, child labor decreases.
Okay.
And I think this is an interesting, deeper point, which is many of the things that we see as progress in society is often attributed to some law or, you know, et cetera. And that's true. And what's interesting about it is I think that what seems to be the case is that the evidence shows that those societal movements seem to have been pushed by economic progress. And whatever society you're in, unless it's totalitarian, there's going to be some group that's going to say, hey, we don't really need children in the mines because we're rich enough. And so that's one, you know, common thing that I hear is you need government to pass a child labor law. No, if you live in a voluntary society and you're rich, you're not going to send your children to mines.
Right.
And you may create some agreement between each other to not do that or give money to somebody that's poor or whatever. But this is a wonderful, you know, piece of evidence that no matter the political system, as countries get wealthier, child labor goes down. And that's just, it's kind of intuitive too. You don't need children working.
Yeah, exactly. And I've always also looked at the whole child labor thing as completely different than how most people see it. Like, it's a horrible thing when you have these children that are working in these horrible sweatshops and in China and these in India and stuff like that. But at the same time, like, you have to look at the whole history, right? You got to look at the facts. I mean, a lot of these kids were actually in a much worse place before they were working in these factories. And it's actually a step up, even though it is a horrible situation. If the factory were to just shut down and say, okay, we're not going to have any of these children working here, then those children would be slaving on a farm or something, and they wouldn't, possibly be starving. All these really bad things that I think people are missing when they talk about that stuff.
Yeah, that's a big subject. I was fascinated by Tom Woods had a podcast where he mentioned that there was a case, I forget the country, and some people forced the government to pass some child labor laws, and then some nonprofit followed up a few years later, and they found that a lot of the children ended up being sex slaves because that was their only other option. So, yeah, that's a big subject where you often just see one side, and it's...
Yeah, I mean, the answer is just more wealth. I mean, that's...
Right. And to create more wealth, you do need to accumulate, machines and skills and capital, and it's difficult to just skip that process. And that process does involve what many see as the negatives of, the Industrial Revolution and these types of labor, factories. Mm-hmm. But those people do need to build up skills. Now, there may be times when they're, in that progression, those people are used, and that should be, we should try to avoid that for sure. But at some point, a farmer does need to somehow learn the skill of, sowing something or whatever. That just doesn't come from nowhere.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So environment, this is obviously a highly controversial topic. I'm sure you've got some pushback on some things in your life at some point about environment, because people get really fired up about all their theories on what's going to happen and what's correct and what's being made up. But so the myth, or not necessarily the myth, but the idea that is thrown out there a lot in the media and among people that you just kind of meet is that climate change is going to destroy the planet. Now, do you think that's true? Do you think we should be scared and worried and freaking out about this?
I think it's lower on the priority list, and I have looked at the evidence, and I follow Ridley on this. He calls himself a lukewarmer. Mm-hmm. So I accept that the Earth is warming. I accept that CO2 is a part of that. I accept humans are a part of that. But the evidence seems to suggest that it doesn't appear likely that there's going to be a tipping point. And the UN, in their latest 2015, I think, report, or 14, they show an interesting graph which shows the actual temperature versus the projections that they were making, that all of these tipping point scenarios were coming from. And the quote from their report is, it's kind of a complicated quote, but basically the values are in the lower part of the likely range. Mm-hmm. And in this graph, you see that it's at the bottom of all of those models. Right. And so if that lines up with the idea that... So this is a big topic, but so CO2 doubling does cause an increase in temperature, but most of the scenarios where it's a disaster were based off of this idea that there's essentially a multiplier of this feedback effect. And there's a lot of scientific debate about that. That's not consensus. And so far, and especially in the last few years, people are, taking that down from what they had thought it would be. Mm-hmm. So, it seems likely that it's not going to be catastrophic.
It's tough because, some people, it's like we kind of have this dichotomy in the U.S. where it's like you're either left or you're right? And if you're a left-winger, you have to believe this certain set of ideas. And one of them is typically you're going to be against any kind of war, and you're also going to be an environmentalist. So meaning that you want everything to be regulated, the environment to be regulated. And so what goes along with that, it seems, is that there's a lot of fear in terms of what's going to happen. Like, oh my God, the world is going to just end because we're all idiots and we're polluting too much and we're all bad. And I think that's where I struggle with just seeing people get more positive about that, more optimistic about the course that the Earth is on, and that we actually might not destroy ourselves like people say.
Yeah, and one of the wonderful statistics, and I'm an environmentalist, I think that economic progress, there's clear evidence on some of the next charts that pollution is going down, and that's a lot to do with better technology, et cetera. But one of the most fascinating things is that, and this is consensus, that the Earth right now is net greening, which means that on net, there's more greenery than 20 years ago or so. And partly this is because of increasing CO2, because plants and trees use CO2 as energy. Mm-hmm. And also it's because we tend to move towards large cities. So a lot of farmland, and it's also because of fertilizers and things like that that mean less cropland per person. So there's a lot of factors that if you put them all together, I mean, I agree that we still overburden the environment in some ways, but if you put all of the things together and the trends, it seems to me that it's reasonable to conclude that we are going to take better care, give more land back to the earth, let's say, than we're using, and that it doesn't seem like there's going to be a catastrophe.
Yeah, and then you see on the news all the catastrophes in terms of the weather incidents like hurricanes and tornadoes, and those make really big headlines. And then you see all the there's a lot of deaths and things like that. But you have a graph that shows that actually we're completely on a downtrend in terms of deaths and death rates due to climate-related disasters.
Oh yeah, it's an amazing graph. I mean, it's gone down by some 200 times.
Yeah.
And that's a lot to do with economic progress. So
Right.
One of the most fascinating things is if you compare the tsunami in Indonesia versus some of the terrible environmental effects in modern advanced countries, the death rates are just so different because they don't have the technology, the medicine, the building strength, all these things that most of us now have, and that's what's really stopping the effects of the environment.
Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah, I love these. You have a lot of graphs here. This is great. And then the last one I want to get to before we sign off is, and this is an important one, is that inequality. It's a word that's tossed around quite a bit. And I think a lot of people that travel too, they see the inequality out there because I grew up in a very nice area and in a country that has quite a bit of freedom. And you get older and you go out there and travel and you go to third world countries and you just see this like absolute poverty and how people like don't even have a grasp of what it's like to have some of the things that we have. And here we are complaining about like, oh, my Uber ride was 3 minutes late, and, stuff like that. And then you look at these countries where it's like they can't even imagine having a vehicle to drive around in. So it does seem like there's this inequality out there, and I understand this notion that we need to fix that, and there's got to be some kind of program that we can fix it, and whether it's a government program or like donating to some cause or something like that. So what is it that you see as optimistic about this whole idea of inequality?
Well, a couple points. First, going back to the point that global average wealth is increasing, so that's a good trend that will reduce poverty. The second is that their distribution of income seems to be approaching a normal distribution, and that's a complicated way of saying that inequality is decreasing globally. So it may be increasing in, let's say, the US or some advanced countries, but globally it is decreasing. That's kind of shocking statistic. This is based off Gini coefficients and all that. And also one of the key statistics is that while it's true that the rich are getting richer in countries like the US, the poor are getting even more richer. And so now it is true that a lot of other countries are slower than they should be. And this has a lot to do with economic progress and the limits to that. There's a great book called Dead Aid, which shows how it just doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And we really need to break down the barriers and going back to your podcast, create freedom and voluntary exchange that creates prosperity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Why is that? Do you know, why is it that aid doesn't work? Because it seems like on the surface level, taking money from rich people or rich countries and giving it to poor people in poor countries would kind of help even this out.
I'm not an expert in that. I don't know. But I would suspect it's just because if you just get aid, you're going to just use it. You're going to consume it. But economic progress is creating skills, capital, machinery, infrastructure, all those things that we see around us in a modern society. You don't get that by just decree. You don't get that by central planning.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
But that book, Dead Aid, goes into more of the arguments against just simple aid.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Do they get into the stuff like giving, like the U.S. is notorious for giving money to all these places, and like they give money to Africa, but it actually just goes to whoever the dictator is, and then they take the vast majority of the money and never gets down to the people.
Exactly. And in fact, one of the things she does is she compares countries that are getting aid versus countries that are more independent, and they're growing faster, their poverty is reducing faster, things like that.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I forget the country names offhand, but
Yeah, yeah, that's totally interesting. Well, that's great. Yeah. So you have a little thing on what about evil? I kind of get away from the whole idea of good and evil because it doesn't seem to help anything when you think about any situation if you kind of let that idea go. But people do have this idea that there's more evil in the world. And I think I was talking about this left-right paradigm that we have in the US. And, I talked about a little bit about the left and the right. It seems like the fear is always terrorism. It's like there's a boogeyman out there and we're all in danger of this thing because there's so much evil in the world and evil wants to get us good people here in the US, right?
I highly recommend it's a 15-minute YouTube. It's a TEDx video by Michael Huemer, one of my favorite philosophers. And it's on YouTube. It's called The Irrationality of Politics. And he shows how if you just compare terrorism, which has a very small death rate compared to murder. And so if we want to be worried about evil, we should look at murder. That's much more likely to kill you. And that is still a problem. But again, that's going down. That's a good trend. But yeah, morality, it's a tough one. But I think one thing that I think seems to be likely is that as we get richer, we seem to be more moral. I think this is a correlation that I have no proof for. Yeah. This is just kind of something it seems to be true. And it makes some sense. Like taking child labor, for example. This child didn't choose to be born, but now you're kind of using it in a way. Mm-hmm. But if you're rich enough, you don't need to. And, they can just do their own thing. So I think there's good evidence that, and this is one of my big arguments, is that for voluntarism, is that I think that we'll move towards a voluntary society as we get richer.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So to kind of wrap it up, just wanted to get your ideas on, well, first of all, what about the idea that, and you mentioned this in your presentation at Libertopia, so what about if there is a big disaster, and how do we maintain this optimism going forward with there being negative things, like let's just say like another 9/11 or something like that? How do we keep this optimism or maintain it or really keep focusing on it?
Right. So there's, I think, two aspects to that. One is a personal psychological aspect, that how do you deal with the things, the reality as it is. So that's part of it. That's a big topic. But I think as a society, the more wealth we have, I think it really all comes back to that, the more likely we can handle terrible catastrophes. And I think we have a good history of handling those. So I think we have good precedent.
Yeah, I totally agree. And you had a little bit also on just kind of being grateful in general and things in your own life and taking it to a personal level, as opposed to focusing on the outer external world that you can't really control anyway. You just focus on yourself and like what's going on in my life. That's great. And then you had a meetup back last year. You held one of your Radical Optimism meetups, and we were kind of going through and talking about stuff that we're happy about in our lives and that we're grateful for, and taking things that could potentially be negative and turning them into positives, right? And I really like that whole idea.
Yeah, so this is one thing, a good place to end maybe, is that for practically speaking, whether or not you agree with all the points made today, and please review the evidence and disagree where something's wrong, but one practical thing that seems quite clear in the evidence in positive psychology is that if at the end of every night you write down 3 things that went well that day, it seems like you'll be happier.
Sounds like a good plan to me.
Yep.
Can't go wrong there. Yeah, that's awesome. So are you still doing the Radical Optimist meetup?
It exists, but I've just been too busy.
Yeah, I haven't seen one.
I want to.
Yeah, for sure. So if anyone out there listening is in the San Diego area, where Kevin is going to have another meetup here sometime soon, and being that it's summer right now, or just about summer, I think it's the perfect time to have one of those outdoor, in a park or something. So that would be a cool little get together.
Yeah, in fact, I'll set one up tonight.
Okay.
In a few weeks or a month or so.
Cool. Do you have a website that people can see, or something where they can find out more about your work and everything?
Yeah, it's radicaloptimism.org.
Cool. And that has your presentation on it, right? The whole thing we went through?
Presentation. Cool. It's a wiki, and it's got all the evidence. And if you don't mind, I'd love to end on this quote by Gokhale at the end.
Absolutely.
Thanks. So this is a quote from The Improving State of the World. Despite recklessly increasing its numbers, humanity has never been better fed, healthier, or longer lived. The average person's lifespan has more than doubled. He is better educated and wealthier. She is freer to choose her rulers and express her views. Her professional, social, and physical mobility is less likely to be circumscribed by caste, class, location, or other accidents of birth. Not only is work less physically demanding, he works fewer hours, earns more, and has more leisure time at his disposal. The proximate causes for the improvements in the human condition are the forces of technological change and economic growth, supplemented by trade in products, ideas, and technologies, like the technology we use to talk today.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, that's a great quote. And yeah, without Skype, I mean, we we could probably get together because we're local, but it makes things a lot more difficult. So yeah, that's really cool stuff. And Kevin, I really appreciate you coming on. It's been a pleasure chatting and getting a lot of optimism here on the show. And yeah, good luck with everything. And I'm sure we'll be talking soon.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Freedom Lovin' Podcast. To break free today, head on over to freedomlovin.com and download our free guide. 7 practical tips to living free in an unfree world.